Well, this week in South Africa, in fact, is the International Gas Week 2013, and that's being held till the 12th of April. Of interest to South Africans, of course, and if we look at the energy situation in the country, our two new power stations that are coming online hopefully soon, and of course other alternative power sources that are being looked at. And that's basically this conference is going to be exploring that. It's going to be looking at gas energy, where the gas fields are, extraction of gas. It'll be interesting to see what the advantages are for South Africa. Also very controversial will be the fracking in the Karoo, which the moratorium ended there. And we're going to be looking at many of those different aspects of the gas industry this week. And in the studio with me, I'd like to welcome Busi Mhlanga-Mjimba, Senior Project Manager on Conferences at IIR South Africa. Busi, nice to have you with us. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Glenn. Thank you very much.
John Langus, Commercial Director, Sunbird Energy. Thank you for joining us in the studio. John, nice to have you with us.
Thank you, Glenn.
And on the line is Tristen Taylor, Project Coordinator of Earthlife Africa, Johannesburg. Tristen, thank you for joining us. Tristen, you with us? Tristen, you with us?
I am.
Thanks. Good evening and welcome.
Welcome. Welcome to be on Classic FM.
Busi, if I may ask, let's start with you. The fact that we actually have interestingly, a Gas Week 2013, it's an international event. The importance of gas, not just to South Africa, but globally, the fact that we're having a conference on it.
Okay. I'm sure you'll agree with me that 10 years ago, more so for Africa, gas was a non-story. And the idea behind running a gas week this year has been to introduce all the stakeholders involved in the gas industry and create an ideal platform for ideas sharing and collaboration. This is the reason why IIR has put the conference together. This is the third time running the conference. We've specially labeled it Gas Week because it incorporates the various forms of gas which we envisage will become a real and viable energy source for Africa.
As you know, it's the third time we're having this conference, which means there's been lots of dialogue but not much done yet.
Yes, I'll agree to that. For a big subject matter like gas, you would expect to have a lot of that dialogue, and so there's a lot of momentum that is building up around shale gas, the controversial shale gas in the Karoo Basin of South Africa.
How highly do you think that's going to feature on the list this week?
It's going to feature quite a lot because on the program we have 3 days set aside specially for shale gas discussions. We have some speakers coming in from the US, from Penn State University, who are very knowledgeable about shale gas and will also share what's happening internationally as well as in the US and try and relate to the discussions to do with shale here and what South Africa can do about shale gas.
John, if I may ask, just to put our listeners in the picture, I mean, gas, it's always been there. I think everyone thinks of oil, and oil is the source of everything, and then of course coal, and both of course are fossil fuels, but so is gas, is it not?
No, that's exactly right. Gas is newer on the scene. It's been a prominent fuel for about 40 years as opposed to 100 years for oil and 150 years for coal. But it's now about 20% plus of the global mix of energy now in the world economy.
And when we talk about gas, because that's what I'd actually like to clear, we have Gas Week, but there's more than one type of gas underground, is there not?
No, that's right, and that's one of the interesting things about gas is that you have sort of two areas of energy that we think about. You've got primary energy that goes into things like coal, oil, wood, not wood, wood on the other side. On the other side, you have energy that people use. You have wood in some parts of the world, you have electricity, you have petrol and diesel, you have bottled gas that we use sometimes. And gas is interesting that it's both. Gas is interesting in that it's both.
Yeah.
It's a primary fuel that's used to fuel electricity plants and petrochemical processes, but it's also a direct energy source that people can just plug into their stove, light on fire, and use directly in their everyday lives.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but gas reserves are normally found deeper than oil reserves.
That is, yes, that's typically true. It's deeper, higher pressure, hotter. So if it's typically, if it's lower pressure, cooler rock formations, it stays as oil. As it gets hotter and under higher pressure, it cooks away and becomes gas.
Now, when we see that as the solution to, and if we look, let's just take South Africa as an example, and we say gas will be possibly our future in energy and in many different forms, because you can do so much with gas. How much money has to be invested into it? Surely it's very expensive to tap into it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends on how much of it you want to, how much you want to transform the economy with it. But it's on the scale of developing oil resources and coal resources and renewable resources. It's all fairly expensive these days. There's not any cheap energy anymore.
And if we look at the two sources that I mentioned before, we're looking at oil and coal. What do you think the life of coal is for the planet? Because people give so many different versions. Some say 50 years, some say 100, 200 years. In South Africa's case, realistically, how long do you think we can be dependent on coal?
I don't know how long, but I can say that from recent studies that have been done about coal around the world, what people are finding is that the numbers that we all assume for coal are based on very old reserves numbers that have really never been updated. And in the jurisdictions around the world where people have gone through the process of auditing those reserves numbers, in case after case, they've revised those reserves down quite sharply. They've found that in the ensuing period of time, an area, maybe in Pennsylvania in the United States, that does have a large amount of coal has nevertheless been built over in the last 25 years by a subdivision. You're not likely to go into that subdivision, move everybody out, and dig a coal mine there. So you can't really count those reserves anymore. And so we're finding that in place after place when we actually look at it and say, not how much coal is there, but how much coal is there likely to be that we can use. And that seems to be considerably less than we all assume is going to be around.
Have you got a figure that, are you talking hundreds of years?
No, everyone does talk about hundreds of years, but it seems to be considerably less than that.
And as far as the if it is the future, and that's gas energy, and where are the gas fields in the world at the moment? The operational ones are the ones that are under exploration.
Right, so you have the largest gas producers in the world are Russia, Iran, Qatar, the United States, China. Those are the big producers. Australia has large reserves. Canada has large reserves. So gas is spread fairly widely around the world, unlike, for example, coal, which is concentrated in a smaller number of countries.
And then you look at something like the Karoo. How on earth did we know that there was gas under the Karoo? What makes somebody suspect that there's gas in that area?
Right. Well, the Karoo and shale generally is interesting because the knowledge of the gas being there isn't very new. People have known that gas is there for some time. What's changed is the energy economics, which say that going to get that gas is probably more viable than it used to be because the price of gas now has become higher. So you can use more sophisticated technology. That technology has evolved quite a bit in the last 20 years so that it's more feasible to do it more cheaply, but it's still expensive processes. Why
do we call it shale gas?
We call it shale gas because it occurs in a different type of rock than conventional gas, which is a shale rock. And so in a conventional gas reservoir, it's a very porous rock. And so when you stick a well into it, the natural pressure of the reservoir will allow that gas fairly freely to come out of the well. Shale is much denser, so that gas isn't going to move just because of the pressure that's under there. And that's why you have to do fracturing of that rock in order to get that gas to move.
Before we even look at what we call fracking, and if you can explain that to us in a little while as well, does the quality in the different gas fields in the world differ? You can call it shale gas or whatever gas. Is gas gas?
No, absolutely not. No, gas, when we talk about gas, what we're really talking about is methane. And in gas fields, each gas field is going to differ to some extent in terms of what else is in the rock with the methane. In the best case scenario, you have very little of anything else, so you don't have to treat the gas very much. It's basically ready to come out and be used. Very different from crude oil that has to be processed in a refinery and that sort of thing. But you do have other fields where there's high sulfur contents, there's high nitrogen contents, things like that, which make the gas much harder to use. You need to process it a lot more.
But generally there's less processing than there would be in oil.
Yes.
So that would make it, in the long run, it might be more expensive to get it out, but in the long run probably cheaper to actually use as an energy source, or not really?
That's not obvious. It again depends on lots of stuff. The shale gas is definitely an order of magnitude more expensive to develop than historical conventional gas has been.
Why are we exploring something like the Karoo if it's going to be so expensive? Is it because we're running out of reserves, not just South Africa, globally?
Well, there's a lot of benefits to using gas, right? On the positive side, it's far cleaner than what we use currently. It's about 50% cleaner than coal, by and large, from a carbon emissions standpoint, about 30% cleaner than oil. It's also easier to use in a lot of ways. Like we talked about, if you're talking about developing a new neighborhood and wanting that neighborhood to burn gas for heating, that saves our electricity grid a lot of work, because instead of having electric stoves, they have gas stoves. That helps Eskom to keep up with the rising demand in the country. It's also a more efficient way to heat your food, heat your house, because you're just directly using the fuel rather than transferring it into electricity. So it's quite useful in that respect. It's worth doing in that respect. In the electricity industry, it's particularly useful because of the way that gas-fired electricity generation works. So with gas-fired electricity, it's far more flexible in terms of being able to be turned on and off. And so around the world, and what we hope to see in South Africa here as well, you find that renewables portfolios in utilities industries are being supported by gas-fired electricity generation. So as the wind dies down for a wind farm, you call up the gas-fired generator and you can turn that up and down with a great deal of flexibility and a great deal of time.
Not necessarily at a cheaper cost though.
Not necessarily at a cheaper unit cost.
Tristen Taylor, Project Coordinator, Earthlife Africa, Johannesburg. Tristen, of course, I'm sure you're aware of Gas Week 2013, and I'm sure you've got some interesting thoughts on gas. Firstly, renewable energy. I mean, that's something you're interested in. Tell us your thoughts on gas. And I don't want to even look at the Karoo yet. Let's get to that at a later stage. But gas as a source of energy in South Africa.
It's probably not very viable, at least for another 10 years, even on a best-case scenario. The infrastructure that would be required to bring in gas, provided we don't frack the Karoo, is quite substantial, and it would take at least 10 years to bring it in, whether we do LNG, liquefied natural gas, or maybe we pipe it in from Mozambique, though that's probably a lesser option than shipping it in from Mozambique, which would be our best source. However, we would buy that on the open market, so we would be subject to the vagaries of gas prices on the world commodities market. Renewables doesn't get affected by world commodity prices. I mean, the wind is the wind wherever you are. So I don't think we're going to see a huge gas revolution, at least in another decade. What we fear is that the hype around gas, which is primarily coming out of the States at the moment, a little bit out of Europe, is that it will take our policymakers down a long, expensive road, which will have a high opportunity cost for developing renewables in South Africa. We only have a finite amount of money to spend on energy. It's a very big amount that we have. But as your previous speaker said, this stuff gets quite expensive quite quickly. Do we go spend it all on nukes? Do we go spend it all on gas? Or do we actually try and develop a domestic renewables industry? And we're sort of voting for the latter. Gas is sometimes considered to be cleaner than coal, especially in particulate emissions. Coal has a lot of nitrous oxides, sulfurous oxides, mercury, really nasty stuff. So we shouldn't burn coal. But gas also has high carbon emissions. And in a lot of the calculations of the carbon emissions from gas compared to coal-fired power stations, it's often assumed very low rates of leakage from wellheads or from pipelines. So if you assume a more realistic figure of somewhere between 7 to 10%, to give you a sort of scale of the issue, if we shut off all the coal-fired power stations and replace them all with gas, the difference in global warming would be 0.5 degrees Celsius. So as for a solution to climate change, gas is not it. We know that. I think that's pretty much apparent. And so we just got to be careful of a lot of hype. And a lot of this hype, it's interesting you're talking about a conference. I mean, every other week I get mails come through my box about some energy conference. So they happen quite frequently. And a lot of it is actually commercial hype over particular sources. We saw that in the States recently, shale gas. There's a lot of hype around it, and a lot of those companies are now gone bankrupt. Especially with shale oil, which is a slightly different scenario.
Tristen, if we're looking at and what John was saying is that when we're looking at oil reserves and coal reserves, we're not talking hundreds of years of supply left for this planet.
Well, we have 20 years of supply for coal.
Are we talking about South Africa?
No, I'm talking globally, because if we burn coal beyond 20 years, we can kiss goodbye to our climate.
So what about these two power stations?
On coal. But for South Africa, about 2 years ago, we reduced our reserves from about 200 years to 111 years. And what people often forget in reserve statistics is that the second half of your reserves, or the remaining part, is usually more dirtier. Dirtier. It tends to be more expensive. And it's generally nastier stuff because you've mined out or you've extracted the best stuff first. It's a fairly common resource curve that goes throughout all extractive industries.
Well, if we remove coal then, and we remove oil, and in your opinion, if you say gas is all, hot air, can our country power itself without any of those resources?
Well, I think that's a slight misnomer. I mean, I don't think anyone's saying in the next 10 years we're going to go to 100% renewables. Maybe in the next 50 to 60 years we'll go to somewhere, say, between 80 to 100 on a very high ramp-up scenario. There's no laws of physics that say we can't do this. And people, I think, often underestimate the scale of what is actually required in order for us to have a long-term stable climate that is not really nasty for our health and everything around us. We need to undergo an energy revolution. I mean, something similar to what happened in the Industrial Revolution, where we transferred from firewood and human power, mostly slave power, to coal-fired generation. We need to go under a similar transition, and that's going to be no easy thing. So I'm not going to come on air here and say renewables is the easiest solution. However, I'm going to say it's probably the only solution if we want to live in anything where our children, or mostly our children, our grandchildren, but in order to do that, we have to start now. And this goes back to my earlier point, is that a fixation on gas now comes at an opportunity cost which we'll pay for in decades from now.
Now, again, if we're looking at, and you say the emissions of gas, it may be less than coal or even oil-driven plants. Have you done studies in any parts of the world where that's been proven?
Yeah, there's been a considerable amount of studies happening in the States at the moment. It is an ongoing consideration, but it is generally well known that, yes, it does produce less carbon emissions than coal. B, it produces a heck load more than renewable energy. And C, it really depends on the rate of leakage. It leaks. When it goes up into the air, it goes in as methane, which is what gas is. That has a huge global warming potential, about 20 times more than carbon dioxide. And then the atmospheric chemistry produces, after a while, that methane actually becomes carbon dioxide. So what you get is a very long tail of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this information is known, but generally people with the money don't speak the loudest, and the people without the money speak the softest. And so I'm very happy you got me on here to speak at all, because I have no money.
Who are the people with the money?
Generally the oil companies, the gas companies, the established energy players. I mean, there is a lot of money in gas. There's an incredible amount of money in oil. We don't have to look farther in our country than Sasol. I mean, Sasol is making a profit margin that you really only see in cocaine. So,
and you
I
would
mean,
know that by reading about it, correct, Tristen?
Well, we know what Sasol's breakpoint of its new plant in China is, because that's been published in the financial press, and that's somewhere between $32 to $35 a barrel. Oil sells at $110 a barrel now. There's your profit margin.
Tristen, I'm going to come back to you because it's an interesting point. What I just wanted to ask you, Bosie, in terms of the conference, I think the most public reaction is going to be the controversy around shale under the Karoo and fracking. How much time are you going to give to our Greenpeaces, our Earthlifes, our World Wildlife Funds to express their opinions on gas?
Okay. Like I said before, the conference structure is such that we have three whole days dedicated around the subject of shale gas alone. We have someone coming through from Treasure the Karoo Action Group, which is part of the green side of things, the anti-fracking guys, and she will probably give a presentation on why we shouldn't go ahead with shale, what the problems with shale are to the environment, to the community. That will be about an hour long. But to round off the conference, the main conference, which will be on Thursday, late afternoon, we have a very exciting panel discussion on whether shale gas will actually work for South Africa and what lies ahead from an environmental perspective, from an economic perspective, from a commercial perspective. So I can't quite say the discussions are just based on those two particular topics, but they'll be ongoing within the 3 days.
But there will be voices heard to the opposition to it, because it has been loud in our country.
Certainly. I know the discussions have really reached fever pitch. There will be a lot of voices heard. I'd really encourage listeners to come through. Registrations are still open. They can go on to www.gasweek.co.za to register and come and listen in and be part of the discussion.
And can they voice their opinions on this?
Yes, they may.
John, back to you. You are a gas expert, and Tristen, I'm not ignoring you for now because I'm sure you're also going to have some thoughts on this. I think it's probably the most awful word that's been introduced into the English vocabulary in the last 3-4 years is fracking. It's very difficult to say on air and often ends up coming out as almost something else. But why is this called fracking?
It's an unfortunate shorting of hydraulic fracturing, which I admit is a bit of a mouthful, but yeah, it does make for better bumper stickers. Hydraulic fracturing is the process by which we get the gas to flow out of these shale formations. So what you do is you pump under significant pressure water, a bit of sand, and a bit of chemicals into the rock formation.
Okay, back a step. Sorry, you're going to have to guide us through this.
Yeah.
We're starting from surface in the Karoo.
Okay.
So we arrive on the farm that we're now going to frack on, and to start fracking we need sand and we need water, and that water has to be pushed down at a high speed. Where's the water coming from?
It depends on where you are. So in the Karoo, that's been a big part of the discussion. I think that's been part of the
controversy.
It's been part of the controversy, and that's clearly an issue in the Karoo. I don't think the industry has disputed that either. So early on, the early exploration that will happen will have water trucked in. After that, if it looks to be a viable activity, if the early results are promising, then the developers of that acreage will have to, as you would say down here, make a plan. They'll have to, and most of what's talked about is probably a pipeline bringing water into the Karoo. But there's also, this technology is evolving extremely rapidly, and there are companies now in the States that are experimenting with saltwater using salt water, using historically you've had to use pretty fresh water to do it.
I suppose surely salt water will interfere with your water table because you're putting saline into a natural area that's not saline.
You've got to remember how deep this is. So you've got the surface, then you have surface water that's used for most farming, goes down at most a couple hundred meters. Below that, ancient aquifers are I'm not sure I'm getting out of my expertise here, but they're deeper. But then below the aquifer is you go down quite a ways before you get to where the gas is.
From what I understand, it's well below a kilometre.
Yes.
So you do go through the water table to get to the gas.
Correct. You go way below it, and remember the whole point of this, the whole thing that makes this rock difficult, is that things don't flow through it. So the likelihood that water would go several thousand meters from where you're doing the hydraulic fracturing, which if you do it right creates fractures in the rock tens of meters, maybe hundreds of meters from where the well bore is. That it would be able to migrate that far through the rock is extremely unlikely. And after 1 million wells that have been hydraulically fractured in the industry to date, there's been one case that's inconclusive about whether there's been migration into a agricultural water supply.
Of course, John, you were mentioning the whole water issue, and that is a huge concern. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Tristen. Hydraulic fracturing or fracking in the Karoo, what do you believe is the environmental damage will be, or proven environmental damage will be?
Well, I don't think anyone really knows 100% sure what will happen, or has a really likely idea how bad fracking may be. Now, under our current legislation, under the National Environmental Management Act, we're not supposed to do anything unless we have a really good idea. So part of our call is for government to actually obey the laws of South Africa, and especially the intergenerational rights, and to really, really take a very strong look at this, and to not do it until you're incredibly sure. And we're not incredibly sure. I think a lot of the domestic research that has been going on about it has thrown up significant warning signs.
When you say we're not 100% sure,
we're not even, I think, 90% sure or 80% sure. The environmental impact assessments haven't even been done yet, so we're a long way from knowing how sure we are.
But then, when we have reassurance from the oil companies that this is actually going to, I actually distinctly recall an interview with one of the oil companies, and they said you won't even notice that the fracking is being done, that the unit is so small it would fit inside something the size of a garage of a car, and that the pump is a very small little thing, that we won't even notice anything's going on.
Well, I mean, they probably said something similar in the Niger Delta as well.
Ouch.
I think, the oil and gas industry has a terrible track record. I mean, we just must face up to that. So whatever exploration that they say they want to do, wherever it may be, must be taken with a very cynical eye, and to be done right. What we really have in the Karoo is that we have two competing resources here. One, we have water, which is by and far South Africa's most precious
and
resource.
Sheep.
And it's irreplaceable. We lose an aquifer, and the Karoo aquifer is quite interconnected. So one part gets contaminated, it will spread. So if we lose it, then we have lost a significant resource for generations. On the other hand, we have a gas resource which will be extracted for profit. And I'm not quite sure what they want to really do with that gas resource. I've never really got my head around that. Do they want to burn it in power plants? Do they want to do GTL with it? That's gas to liquid, such as Sasol does. It's not quite clear on what they want to do with the gas. That point to one side. Your previous guest, actually, I think, John, he might have said it the best. If you do it right, and that's a really big if, on something which if you can muck it up, you can muck it up for centuries, if not longer. So it really is something which should not be rushed into at all and should be further researched. And I think we've done far enough research on it. And we've had quite a few academics come out against it who, are in the know about not fracking in the Karoo. So I think government is rushing this decision and should not rush this decision. It should not frack in the Karoo. We are nowhere near close to having any kind of scientific certainty that this is a good option for us. And there are alternatives. And this goes back to my earlier point about opportunity costs. So here as a country, we're spending all this time debating fracking, which even on a best case, that the wells that do exploration don't actually pollute the environment, they may not even find a credible resource there. They think they have one, but they don't know for sure, and they have to drill to do that. And so we're spending all this time when we have alternatives which are sitting in front of us. I mean, we have huge solar thermal potential in South Africa. I mean, it makes other countries green with envy, or well, bright with envy, however you would call it. And that we should be paying our attention there. So as a society, we're not looking at the right thing. We're being distracted by something which is at dubious value at best and at worst an environmental disaster.
Tristen, if you had to summarize your main concern about exploring for gas in the Karoo, would that be then damage to the water aquifers, allowing gas into an aquifer that is already very stretched as far as water supply goes?
From an environmental point of view, that would be one. Second would be carbon emissions. That would be the second one. The third one is more of a social point of view. Extractive industries, especially shale gas, which the wells don't have very long lifespans for, they tend to have to drill quite frequently, move quite often to extract the gas. There can be significant social upheaval in which communities are actually left poorer than they are today, and more unemployment than exists today. So if an agricultural community finds that it no longer can do agriculture effectively or get pushed out by fracking, there's a significant amount of job losses there. The fracking goes away, that community never gets back to where it was, and we're actually left with a poorer community in the Karoo than we are at the moment. So we must be very careful to see who does this benefit, why does it benefit them, and what are the alternatives.
Well, see, the conference itself, say water being one of the main concerns, is that going to be addressed?
Yes, certainly. We have Mike Smart coming through from the Department of Water Affairs, who will discuss the shale exploration in the Karoo Basin and the concerns on water management options. He'll also touch on the gaps in existing regulations and probably suggest best practices in protecting water sources while allowing economic development associated with shale.
John, back to you. Before I'm going to ask you about sunbird energy in a moment, but you seem to know a lot about fracking. And what I wanted to just ask you, if we look at any mine that's put down in South Africa, any of our deep mines, gold mines, we feel earth tremors when the earth shifts, and that's obviously we've altered something down there. Surely fracking is going to actually have much of the same effect. You are interfering with something that's been lying down there for millions of years, and suddenly you push this hydro-powered sand water device, I don't know what you called it, but if you're putting that, you are actually, can that not cause earthquaking and tremors?
To go to the beginning of your question, I have no idea about any of this with the mining. It's a question that's been raised with hydraulic fracturing. It came up in the UK, I believe, in one case, and it's come up in a couple of cases in the United States where the question has been asked. My understanding is that they're still in the process of doing academic studies as to whether they think that was a triggering factor or even a contributing factor. And the question is whether the whole point of the fracturing, again, right, is to push this water into natural, very tiny fissures in the rock. And the question is, if in doing that you inadvertently connect to an existing fault, will that pressurized water be sufficient to move that fault, right? One of the pieces to that is that the fault is going to naturally move over the course of time anyway. Right? That's where earthquakes happen. But that's not going to be of any consolation to someone who's on that fault. So it's a question that's been asked. It still seems to be being investigated. I don't think anyone really knows the answer to that, except that there's been a whole bunch of it already done in the United States, and there's been, I think, two examples where the question's been raised.
Obviously, you've travelled a long way to be at the Gas Conference 2013. Tell us about Sunbird Energy and your interests in gas.
Sure. Sunbird Energy is an Australian-based company that's active in southern Africa. We're partnered with a local company called Umbono Capital in doing coal bed methane gas development in the northern part of the country, as well as in Botswana. And in December, Sunbird also reached an agreement to take over the Ibubesi gas field, the majority interest of it, which I had historically worked on for another company, Forest Exploration. So I'm in the process of transferring across to Sunbird with that project. Ibubesi, our project off the west coast, has the distinct advantage of not requiring any hydraulic fracturing whatsoever. It's very, very easy conventional drilling for high-quality gas that doesn't have anything nasty in it. So I find the debate on the fracturing very interesting, but we're not actually involved in the shale gas in South Africa.
But the projects you're working on and the gas that's being extracted, is that gas, let's say, the quality of that comparable to standards around the world?
Yeah, no, the gas at Ibubesi is excellent quality gas. It requires very little processing to go into the pipeline. The issue that we work on at Ibubesi is creating that initial market, because there's no gas market currently on the Western Cape or the Northern Cape. So we're looking to create a new market there from scratch, using our project as the first one to go forward in what should be a pretty active basin once an initial project gets started. So we're looking at either creating a power plant or providing fuel to Eskom for their existing peaking plant that runs off of diesel fuel. So we're hoping that they would find it interesting to have a cheaper, cleaner fuel to use at that plant, get the production going with that.
So this gas is already being extracted?
It's not already being extracted, but it's already discovered. So we're the largest undeveloped gas resource in South Africa.
And give us a time frame to extraction and when we'll see that enter the Eskom grid. Will we still be alive?
Gosh, I sure hope so. We have about a 30-month development time frame. So once we get to an agreement to sell the gas either to Eskom as a fuel for Onkellig or an IPP project with the Department of Energy, then we think it's just under 3 years to get it fully developed and part of the energy mix.
Would you be able to sell that electricity to Eskom cheaper than it's costing them to generate it? Be careful with this answer.
Right. No, we're not. It depends on how you develop the project as far as baseload power versus flexible power, which we talked about earlier, the real benefit of gas. What we want to use Ibubesi for is to partner with the renewables portfolio. So we want to be that source of power that Eskom can call on at any time of the day. We need you in 5 minutes. We turn up the turbines and we give them the power they need until the wind starts blowing again or until the sun starts shining again. That power is a little bit more expensive power. So that would certainly be more expensive than the headline tariff that everyone sees from Eskom. But on a baseload basis, we think that gas should be perfectly competitive with the Eskom baseload tariff.
Do you not find it frustrating that you have a company that can actually generate electricity and you have to sell it to the government? I'm sure many of us would like to give you our homes and plug in, but we're not allowed to.
Well, that's a little bit of a different issue, and I think Tristen would probably agree that for the renewables, it would be great for individuals to be empowered in that way. I mean, technically, I could sell my electricity to a very large electricity user, one of the big mining houses or industrials that use a lot of electricity. The challenge with Ibubesi is this is a large amount of energy. It's about 450 megawatts we're looking for the first phase. So there's not too many people except for the grid generally, meaning Eskom, that can take that sort of power. So that's not really a concern for us. We think that we can get to a price that's competitive for Eskom and for the system and still provides us a fair rate of return. For us, it's really about getting our project to mesh well with the grid so that it makes sense for everybody.
So at least, Tristen, if I can, I'll have a final word from you. Are you opposed then to companies like Sunbird and what they're developing, or do you see this, at least the countries trying to move away from coal?
Look, we're for moving away from coal. It's a very difficult question. But we'd rather actually, especially in the Northern Cape, that we spend our money in our infrastructure build and the capacity to contract power, which is also finite, on solar thermal resources. We definitely need to try that first before we think about any other options. Saying that, anything in the world is probably cheaper than Eskom's diesel peaking plants. That Eskom runs diesel in its peaking plants, so Eskom, DOE, and nurses should all be batted around their head for running plants like that. It's a terrible waste of money and a terrible waste of diesel. So, I understand the argument. It will be cheaper than what Eskom is currently doing, and it can bring power onto the grid quicker. But for a long-term solution, it's not a solution. And the problem is that the gas as a bridge tends to be a bridge to nowhere from other countries in the world. They tend to use gas and then never get off gas. And they don't go. So we want to try and learn from other countries' mistakes and say, we've got so much money, we've got an opportunity now to change our electricity generation mix. Our coal-fired power stations, our current plants, they're all going to be decommissioned over the next couple of decades. What do we do? And this is a question we have, and we've been having it for about the last 6-8 years.
And I'm sure we're going to be continuing with that question.
We're going to be coming back to it, and we now have a choice. We can spend it on gas, or we could develop solar thermal. There's literally those.
And Tristen, I'm sure you're going with. I'm afraid we're out of time, but I'm sure you're backing solar thermal.
I am. This is one of my
Tristen Taylor, thank you, Project Coordinator, Earthlife Africa, Johannesburg. Busi Mhlanga-Mjimba, Senior Project Manager on Conferences at IIR South Africa. Busi, thanks for sharing your insight onto the conference, and we hope it's not all hot air. There's better be solutions on Thursday. And John Langus, Commercial Director, Sunbird Energy. Live broadcast of Classic Business and Classic Government